Welcome to the launch of the world's first six-part Bookinar series hosted by Etmanksi. Al's latest book, Impact: 6 Patterns to Spread Your Social Innovation, explores in depth each of 6 mutually reinforcing patterns which are being used by successful changemakers. Each 1-hour session in this series, Al will focus on one of the 6 patterns identified in his book and interview the person who revealed the pattern to him, both through their convictions and their work. Today's Bookinar is entitled Set the Table for Allies, Adversaries, and Strangers, and Al has invited Paul Bourne to join him. I will now turn it over to you, Al, to begin this conversation with Paul about setting the table for allies, adversaries, and strangers.
Thank you, Christy. That was a marvelous introduction. And Paul and I have agreed that we're going to dive pretty quickly into our conversation, and we're going to do our best to try and leave as much time for questions as we possibly can. So welcome, everybody. This is my first experience at doing this, at hosting this, and I'm deeply appreciative of Paul and Tamarack and all the others who set it up for giving me this opportunity. I was introduced to the power of dialogue, to the power of conversation, to the power of convening by Paul Bourne. I had known Paul as a consummate community organizer. He was legendary as a community organizer, and in my mind, a community organizer is somebody who sees a target or sets a goal, develops a strategy, and then drives toward it. But as I got to know Paul, and as we met from time to time, because we live in different parts of the country, we'd meet on Mount Royal, walk around the mountain at midnight, or we'd meet on Cortez Island by the ocean, or more often we'd meet in his hometown in the dead of winter in the Kitchener-Waterloo area. And I began to understand that Paul had either expanded or shifted the dimension of community organizing to include dialogue and convening. But it meant something much different to Paul than it did to me. I had seen it really as a means to an end at best, and I had participated in many of them, and I had actually conducted a few, not very well, and to a large extent I felt unfulfilled by them because I didn't know what to do with the conversation. But as I got to know Paul and to hear more about his own shift from focusing on merely strategy, if you will, to this deeper pattern of convening and conversation and dialogue, I began to appreciate that for him, particularly in his work diminishing poverty, reducing poverty, this was an end in itself. It took me a long time to get my head around how could a means become an end. But when it finally dawned on me, when it finally penetrated, and when the aha moment went on, I understood that this was a pattern that had to be in the book. And I am eternally grateful for Paul for bringing this to my attention. And I hope the conversation today will reveal in depth why this is so important. For me, setting the table for allies and friends is a really tough challenge in itself. I seem to have had a career in which I've been fairly utilitarian about my relationships with my own friends and allies, if you will. Not exclusively, but to a large extent, they were always means, the relationships were means to an end. And here's Paul coming along and saying, now I'm setting the table for strangers and allies, of course, and also people who don't like or don't trust each other very well. So that's what the pattern has meant to me and where it's come from. And Paul, I hope I've done justice to the nature of our conversations. Paul, how would you interpret this pattern? Or what does it mean to you when I say set the table for allies, adversaries, and strangers?
Well, first of all, Al, thank you so much for that beautiful introduction to this way of working and thinking together. And And more importantly, thank you for this lovely, lovely book that you've written. Tremendous contribution to community change and social change in Canada. You know, I was inspired by what you said. I'm wondering who you were talking about in some ways. But you know, it's so important to me, and it resonates so deeply with me, that if we're going to change a system, and a system in my work is most often a community. If we're going to change a community system, we need to bring that system into harmony of some sort. And so the system is not just the people that you would normally suggest. And so I spent most of my career bringing together the people from the not-for-profit sector and saying, and maybe some people from government, because they were the people who I naturally understood as the system, as the people that were doing the work and who were trying to bring this change forward in their community. But I began to understand that the system, if one looks at it that way, is just really about creating more and better programs for people. And it wasn't really beginning to understand the question of what needs to change. And if you want to ask the question, what's the change that we want to see, one has to ask the whole system that question, not just the service providers. And so that meant for us, it needed to include, at a minimum, the business community, and most importantly, it needed to include the people that would most benefit should there be a change. So when it came to poverty reduction work, it meant the people who were going to benefit the most if the system were to change would be the people themselves who were living in poverty. It would try to understand, if we were bringing the business leaders in, it was trying to understand, why do they care about a community that is less poor? Why would they care about that? And why would they want to get involved? And then, of course, being an engagement guy, I mean, that's kind of what I see myself. That's my tool. Community engagement is my thing. As Mark Cabage is so fond of saying, he who has a hammer sees everything as a nail. For me, I'm an engagement guy, so I see dialogue and conversation and engaging people as the core tool that we use in order to bring people to bring a system into harmony, to bring a system into exploring new ideas. And then once people are engaged, they're engaged between one another, and ultimately they're engaged in the solution that they agree to. Now, I could talk forever about the solution, because the solutions, when they're single sector, they're very basic and straightforward, because if we're service providers, our solution is always going to be service provider, more service provision. And how do we each do our jobs better? But when you bring the whole system into the room, and as you say, Al, setting the table for allies, adversaries, and strangers, now the outcome is way broader than more service provision. It starts to be looking at improving people's lives in specific ways. It starts to be looking at the human dimensions of neighborliness, of caring, the importance of hope. All these different elements start to come in, which, I love these types of processes and these types of dialogues and this pattern that you're unfolding, because it allows us to come up with the most human solutions rather than professional solutions. And it's not to say that human solutions are not professional, but it does mean that we go far beyond the role of the service provider. And that's, for me, where it becomes very hopeful. My belief is that if a community or a system just changes a little bit, it is way more effective in terms of helping the people in need. So if everyone in a community cares a little bit more and changes just a little bit in their belief that we need to reduce poverty in our community, it's way more effective and a much better outcome than all of us agencies working better together or having the best agency that works at poverty reduction. So that's, for me, the goal of bringing everyone together, that we're not only just being more committed, but that we all become actors.
So, Paul, what can you give us a quick example of a surprising result that came from another field, if you will, or another sector? Just to put it in highlight, among the 100+ tables across Canada that you've convened related to poverty, what is one of the more surprising outcomes of this style of working, or as you say, you're an engagement guy. So what can you give us one?
Well, I can give you a few. In Hamilton, it was so interesting that they had this Hamilton Roundtable on poverty reduction, and they wanted to create a poverty reduction strategy. And they started to engage their community, and they did exemplary work, but they were finding that it was hard slogging getting people to want to talk about poverty. But they were doing such a good job engaging people in engaging the system properly. And they were engaging it widely, and they were having lots of deep conversations, but they didn't seem to be getting traction on the issue of poverty itself. Until one day, when it felt like it was just getting harder than it needed to be, one of the participants said, look, we can talk about all of these good things, but really, I just want Hamilton to be the best place for me to raise my child. And the light went off with everyone in the room, and they changed their name from the Roundtable on Poverty Reduction to Hamilton, the best place to raise a child. And all the agencies started to use that on their letterhead. It became why they existed. Even in the city now, when you drive into the city of Hamilton, their motto is Hamilton, the best place to raise a child. And the surprising thing from that is it was exactly what was going to motivate the system. They nailed it, and it caught on like wildfire. And everyone wanted to be involved in making Hamilton the best place to raise a child. Like, you couldn't have done that. When you're a bunch of service providers, you don't even let that enter your, unless you've got some sort of brilliant marketing concept, but it wasn't a marketing idea. It's a bad marketing idea to make your name of your organization Hamilton, the best place to raise a child. That's a pretty long name. But it caught on like wildfire, and everyone that's been involved in Hamilton knows about that experience, right? And it meant much, much more than a name or a title. It came through a whole range of dialogue and bringing all the right people together. That's what was so exciting. Another area where I've done some really exciting work is in helping systems understand why so many Aboriginal children are in care. And we did a very large process in Alberta in which we engaged almost the entire province, and we engaged with over 1,000 individuals in a dialogue around why are so many Aboriginal children in care. And we ran 10 groups of 100 people per group. And we made sure that at least 60% of the people in the group were Aboriginal individuals, and that we also had represented mothers that have lost their children to care, children that had lived in care, mothers that had taken children into care, the social workers, the police, the psychologists. We had mapped out the whole system of care when a child is taken into care. Now, one wouldn't always perceive it as care, but that's what we called it. And that was the system that we had in dialogue. And then we went into a community and we primarily worked with elders to help us put these events together, and the elders ran the events with us. And we had a lot of circles and dialogue around why so many Aboriginal children were in care, and the kind of surprising results that came from that, and the healing that occurred. It was so interesting, you know. My opening question in those dialogues were, why is it important that I am here today? Right? Why is it important that I'm here today? Now, that question, Al, it's so meaningless in some ways if you're asking it of people that already know why you're there, and you're saying, well, because our agency does this and this and this. But just imagine, you have a mother that's lost their child to care, a mother that's taken a child into care, and a social worker that took the child. And if they happen to be in a triad that's answering the question, why am I here today? They're bringing all of their fear, their guilt, their pain, their hope, their humanity into that dialogue. And that simple question becomes magical. And it becomes a point of healing. And it opens their door. It opens the door, opens the heart to the exploration, which is the next one. You know, the next question was, what's happening now? Just that simple. And everyone from every sector is able to dialogue and context what's going on. They all bring their story. But again, if it's all one sector, the stories are kind of the same. But when you have all the different players of the system represented at that table, the what's happening now, you immediately get the perspective of the mothers, the children, the psychologists, the police, the caseworkers, the administrators, the elders, the chiefs, right? You get all of these, all of those stories in like an hour of people dialoguing with one another. Then you can move to the next question. So why is it important that I'm here? What's happening now? And then what's the change we want to see? Wow! Such a simple question again. What's the change we want to see? But can you see when you're at this multi-sectoral table how that becomes such an incredible opportunity, because the vision is now rooted in deep experience. And when you hear it, all this healing is taking place, but also this commitment through the healing process, all of this commitment to something different and new. And so when it comes time to come up with action strategies, people are not just waiting for those, they're immediately affected, and they immediately start making changes. What was so lovely in this process is there hadn't been a reduction in the number of Aboriginal children in care in many, many years. And I'm not saying that our process caused the reduction. There was a number of things going on. But certainly people were so motivated when they left in their hearts that they couldn't help but not go back and think completely differently about their work. And once people think completely differently about your work, I mean, Al, you and I have been in community change all of our lives. That's when things start to change. They don't change because things get written down on paper.
So, Paul, thanks. And those stories are not only very illustrative, but they're also very practical and helpful. And I love the questions. And folks, will be able to get a written summary of this conversation as well. So you'll be able to go back and pick up on some of those. Paul, I just want to shift the conversations to something that may be on the minds of some of the listeners, which is in this era of immediacy and quick results and return on investment and impact, there is a challenge to convincing people to invest in conversation, which may yield the results you're talking about quickly, but they may not. They may take time because you're, at heart, you're investing in people's relationships and in the opportunity for trust to begin to build. And so you have a lot of confidence about it, much more confidence than I have. And I've always had trouble making a convincing case to funders and policymakers and decision makers to invest in the kind of engagement that you're talking about. Are there one or two very practical arguments that we can rely on? I mean, you know, aside from the anecdotes and the examples, what have you found effective to get to the heart of the matter with the very good people who allocate money or who are responsible for public policy?
Well, you know, Al, we raise a lot of money for our work, and you know, now that funders have seen the results that we create using these methods, we never have them ask that question any longer. They know. And the first principle for us is sometimes you have to go slow in order to go fast. And that's one of the habits that Peter Senge talks about in the fifth discipline. Sometimes you have to go slow to go fast. And what that means is that you can, if you don't bring everyone onto the same page, you can get to your destination, but nobody got there with you. And so you still got to go back anyway and get everybody to come there, right? Just because you have a great idea, it doesn't mean it's going to get implemented. And so I can give you all the good ideas on paper that you want as a funder. The reality is, and the real question you should be asking me, is the system that we're about to change here, are they on side? And what kind of work are you going to do to bring them on side? And that's where you can talk about, you know, having a clear engagement strategy. You can talk about the collective impact work and why collective impact has shown us over and over again that to have a common agenda and share measurement system are absolutely critical in terms of us having mutually reinforcing activities. And mutually reinforcing activities is just an advanced way of talking about collaboration. You can't get anything done today unless you collaborate. It's just, it is the modern way, and it's the modern way for a whole bunch of reasons, is because we don't just want to service people, we want to enable a positive change in their lives, and we want to enable a positive change in the community so that that change in an individual's lives is sustainable. And in order to do that, we have to work together across many disciplines in order for that to occur. And so, you know, number one is that we got to bring everybody on the same page, and that means having a common agenda and a collective impact, and in doing that, our collaboration is going to be far more effective. Now, there are two other things that are going to be required if you want to really take this seriously, is that we need to have a continuous communication system. And that doesn't just mean a newsletter. That means where the system is really dialoguing and talking, and there are strategies put into place for that dialoguing to be ongoing, that it's positive sharing and good sharing of data, good sharing of information. A lot of systems have, you know, just done the, once they've got a common agenda, their continuous communication is they've got shared intake processes, which is the ultimate for me in designing a system for continuous communication, because everyone has access to the same information. I've been learning a lot lately about radical openness, which I think is a really interesting management philosophy around continuous communication, and then the role of a backbone organization that helps the collaboration to be more effective. So collective impact is very popular amongst funders, and they're beginning to understand the role of engagement and dialogue. So we're not just talking about dialogue, Al, when we're talking about this convening. It is setting the table, and it often looks like dialogue, but if you read the book that I wrote on this called Community Conversations, we begin to understand that conversing is, there are 4 chapters: converse, engage, collaborate, and then casting a vision. So we understand dialogue in the context of people being engaged, working better together, and working together in a strategic way, and collectively casting a vision for the future. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, it is for sure, and you've identified a point I wanted to make, which is that you've written about this. There's material available on the website, all of which people can access, and they can trade on, lean on your experiences for their own conversations with supervisors and the like, to make the point they know to be true, but to make it even more convincing. So, thank you for that, Paul. Paul, you've just
one
raised...
other thing, Al, before you get to another question, is that you were talking earlier that you've learned a lot about dialogue and so forth. But you have an intuitive, and your partner in so much of your work, Vicky Kamak, you guys have such an intuitive ability to enter into a space. And so, I'd like to hear about that as well, because part of what you do so well, and I don't want people to feel like you just get this because you're talking to one another. The thing that you both do so well is that you get a sense, like either you kind of wait for it, you get to know the people, but there is a sense where you can bring a group together so that they desire more because they are together. You bring out the best in people, huh? So can you talk about that a little bit? Just like when you bring groups together, what are some of the techniques you use to bring out the best of those individuals, but also bringing out the best of that group?
Well, yeah, you're turning the tables on me. So this is supposed to be setting the table. But this is good. This is good. I'd have to say for me, I'm a pilgrim at this. It's still very much a work in progress, and I've noticed a significant difference in the conversations I'm having now, where I go into them without an axe to grind or an agenda to fulfill or a target to meet or the like. And I have to say that when I've talked about engagement or dialogue or convening and the like in the past, I've always had in the back of my mind a goal I was heading toward, and this was simply a way to help me get there. So you're not a complete active listener, in that context. So I'm learning. One of the things that I had to let go of was, this commitment to, to a certain result defined by me and, in my perspective or our organization and the like. So that's been helpful for me to, appreciate, and I'm practicing that now. There's a couple of other things I've learned. I love now conversations where food is part of the event, and frankly, I'm very leery of going anywhere these days without people who can touch our heart and help us celebrate and make us feel joy, and those are the artists in our midst, whether they're poets, spoken word poets, or musicians, or singers, or dancers and the like. So these are all part of the, I suppose we could call it dancing on the table, and the like. So these are pieces that I'm learning, and that I've found to break down some of the anxiety about conversation, but also some of the kind of intentionality, to pursue your own agenda, at least in my case. One of the areas that I'm still not quite satisfied I've got an answer for is ensuring that, my goodness, how to describe it, but ensuring that the people who are most affected by the issue are not only at the table, but that they're continuously at the table. And so many initiatives that are dialogical or convening in orientation, begin reasonably well, but then over time we kind of lose the constituency. And I have a sense that you've, found a way through that. How do we, first of all, create a welcoming environment for people who are affected by the challenge or might benefit from some of the solutions that we're devising? And how do we make sure that as professionals or systems people that we don't gradually distance ourselves from them and think that it was enough to meet a couple of times? I haven't wrestled that one to the ground. How have you dealt with that?
That's a great question, Al, and I got to say that talking about being a pilgrim, this is one that's constantly evolving for me and for us. There's a couple of things that have been very helpful. Number one, that to understand that in order for this type of dialogue to work, there needs to be an absolute commitment to having people with lived experience at the table. And what we mean by people with lived experience are those who will benefit the most if we are successful, right? So in poverty, it's people living in poverty or who have a deep experience of living in poverty. In working with Aboriginal children in care, it's either children that have been in care or their parents. We know that they need to be at the table. The elders need to be at the table with us. So there's an absolute commitment to it. And even to such a degree that we're not going to hold any dialogue, any meeting that does not have a quarter of the people that are there being people with lived experience. You don't always meet that goal, but that's your goal every time. The second one is that the leadership roundtable. So we don't run dialogues in the context of a dialogue by itself, and I needed to explain that. Dialogue for us is something that has a one-year, usually, strategy attached to it. And so we might have a whole series of dialogues that are relating to having deep learning and understanding about the system that desires to change, and deep engagement. And so in that 1 year, we always have a leadership roundtable that is made up of the system that we have identified entering into, and 1/4 of that roundtable is always supposed to be people with lived experience. So that's our commitment. The other one is to make sure that we have proper supports for those individuals. And those proper supports include making sure that they can easily get there, having the meetings at times when they're available. We often will team them up with someone because when we have people with lived experience living in poverty, transportation's a big issue. So we try to get people to carpool. We take care of a lot of little things. We always have food at meetings, like these kinds of things that really help you to understand how does it become easy for people to be involved. And that then accelerates their interest and involvement. But then most importantly at the end, that you're actually listening to people. And that's how you keep people at the table, is that their voices, they feel that their voices are heard and that they matter.
Thanks, Paul. That's very helpful. And I'm noticing here both a question and a comment from Edward Van Viet. First of all, he's suggesting that we might want to switch the phrase return on investment to return on community, but as he explains in his note, he's actually thinking of the presence at the table of people who are not yet born or maybe too young to be at the table. He's talking about, if I understand him correctly, an intergenerational mindset. Does that add too much of a complication to you? This intergenerational way of thinking, or as some folks have described, is having a future quotient attached to you. Do you have a quick response to that?
Yeah, it's a good question. More of a good notion, you know. I like it. I like it. Where does that take you, Al?
Well, you know, when I put on, you know, my long-term cap, I'm acutely aware that these big ships, that these big ocean liners that we want to turn around, are likely not going to turn around within 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. That this is generational work. And so it's quite likely that the decisions that we're making or the conversations that we're convening today or the engagement that we're making are actually setting the tone, creating a template, building a different kind of architecture for the inclusion of, you know, not only people who will benefit from the challenge who have the lived experiences you're describing, but also for our children and our children's children. So I'm very, very attracted to this notion. How to make it work practically, I'm not sure. I've often thought, I don't want us to go off on a side topic here, but I've often thought we need an ombudsman for future generation established in our various, you know, legislatures to keep that mind's eye on it. But I think it is quite possible for us to hold that vision, you know, in our hearts. Paul, I'm looking at our hour here, and I think I'm going to just back off a minute here and see if Christy has picked up any questions that she wants to throw into the mix. I've got about 30 more I'd like to ask you, but Christy, is there one or two that have come forward that are a deeper indication of the kinds of things we've been talking about, or that takes us somewhere else?
Mm-hmm. I have one here from Celeste Licorice, who is a thought leader with us, which is wonderful to have her here. She asks, often when people with lived experience are at the table, there is a power imbalance to be addressed. How do Paul and Al create or build in ways for meaningful inclusion?
Well, Paul, to turn the tables.
Oh,
You're the guest today. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, Christy, can you unmute Celeste, or can you have to unmute everybody at the same time?
I think I can unmute Celeste. Just give me a minute here.
Celeste is our resident expert. I mean, come on, she's our thought leader on this area, and I want to hear from her the answer to her own question. She's done this brilliantly, and they've done this. Celeste is from Hamilton, and has really been leading the voice of people with lived experience there. Hi, Celeste.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great.
Good. Hi, Al.
Hi, Celeste. Please take advantage of Paul's question there back to you to enlighten.
So I've noticed in my work that one of the ongoing challenges is to do that. So you sort of remove the barriers that you mentioned, Paul. So you know, there's food, there's bus tickets, there are ways for people to get to and from meetings, but often when you have those sort of system groups that you talk about that are used to making decisions, raising ideas, doing things like that, sometimes the voices who would be most impacted or have ideas don't feel like there is a way for them to be heard or appreciated. And so I was sincere in asking the question to both of you how you sort of work across that challenge, because it's an ongoing thing. So you can engage people, you know, at the beginning it's exciting to be asked, but then when it comes time to make decisions, how do you ensure that people feel comfortable enough even to speak up? Who sort of rallies? Who are the people with power that rally on behalf of those that aren't maybe comfortable? Who? How do you tease them out?
That's great. You know, and I don't know. I mean, Celeste, I think over time, like you, people gain confidence, and it is a challenge to find people that are willing to talk at a meeting like that and share their experience. So it does require us to to find the right people. That's number one, I think, but that's not always as easy as it sounds. Secondly, large group conversations are often, in my opinion, overrated. And breaking groups, like a leadership roundtable of 20 people or 15 people into dyads and triads on a regular basis, to have dialogue first about something and then to come into the larger plenary to have that conversation is another wonderful way to get to hear everyone's voice. I also think that if we start using creative ways of having meetings, such as conversation cafes or even future search, if we use some of these creative processes, but if we do use the boardroom model, which is really a model that was, I mean, I don't want to be too, judgmental here, but it is kind of the old boys club way of making decisions, that we sit around a boardroom table and we basically have hierarchy, and whoever has the most hierarchy gets the most say. I think that there are far better ways of having conversations, and we don't all have to hear what everyone says. Sometimes if we break into small groups and chat that way, sometimes if we do things online, sometimes, but I think we just have to really rethink how we have conversations together in order to allow all voices to shine. Does that resonate with you at all, Celeste?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. It really does, and it sort of underscores how it takes time to build trusting relationships across different platforms and different voices. That's really true. We actually had a roundtable meeting in Hamilton in October, at the end of October, and we did have conversation circles where people were asked to answer questions, and it was nice to engage in dialogues where you had systems people with lived experience, allies and friends just sort of casually speaking and sharing, and knowing that their voices and their opinions and their outlooks were being recorded and would be moved through a process of where does the roundtable go from here. So yeah, I absolutely agree with what you said, and it's good to have you sort of reinforce that sometimes those smaller groups, those less hierarchical boardroom structures are what I think are going to be key for getting and keeping people with lived experience, their voices at the table, because it's not enough just to be there.
Yeah. It's thank you both for this, because, and if I may just, kind of rephrase this part of the conversation, where you set the table matters as well. And it's worth keeping at it. I would suggest that this is a challenge that we've not yet resolved, and it's an area where we need to do a whole lot more learning. And one of the things I've noticed in the social innovation world, that some of the new techniques and methodologies are actually being used to outsource the connections with the people with lived experiences or who are experiencing the challenge. In other words, it's becoming these tools are being used in a sophisticated way to actually prevent people from coming to the table in a meaningful way on an ongoing basis. And so this, I would suggest for our listeners is an area that we need to to hold very, very closely, to be open to surprise and discovery, and to recognize the vital importance of ensuring that people who are experiencing the challenge or who will benefit from the solutions that we're devising are a constant and important and dynamic part of the engagement. Paul, what is one certainty about engagement, dialogue, convening, conversation that you no longer believe?
Wow, that's a great question. I wonder if I believe that all conversation is productive. And I'm starting to actually tell people now, more often than not, to not default by hosting a conversation. Because what they've done is that they've created this open space philosophy. Open space is a beautiful technique for hosting conversations. But, you know, there are two ideas in open space. Whoever comes was meant to come, and whatever happens should happen. I agree with that to some degree, but in open space, it goes beyond that, because there's a very good way of actually holding an open space that is absolutely effective. And therefore, whoever comes was meant to come, and whatever happens was meant to happen. But a lot of people become fairly lazy about dialogue. They don't put a lot of energy into who should be there, about getting the right people there, about making sure it's a multi-sectoral conversation, to making sure that people with lived experience are comfortable. They don't put the energy into it. And then, you know, they just feel, oh, bring them all together and let's have a dialogue. Well, that works when it's a small group of people, but even open space doesn't operate that way. Open space has a very disciplined way of deciding what you want to talk about and how you want to talk about it. And then it has the law of 2 feet. So there's all kinds of things that you bring into that one that are really important. But I find more often that facilitators just feel there's such value in dialogue that just bringing people together. Well, I came to a city that was torn apart by a facilitator who asked the one question at the beginning, thought it was a profound question. And he brought some people together that were quite angry with one another, and he said, okay, so before we start, why don't you share with everyone the one thing that you want everyone to agree with before we leave this table? Well, of course, everyone dug in their heels, and at the end of the meeting, the only thing everybody agreed to was never to meet again. You know, so I think I'm at the point where I've really changed. I've seen so much dialogue being done without thought and care that I'm actually at the point where I want less dialogue, and I want people to take it far more seriously in terms of how they plan for it and what they do when they're there. Does that make sense?
Thanks, Paul. I appreciate the caution. Every technology, every technique, every intervention has a negative side effect. That's a given, and I think you just illustrated, you know, one. And so we use these tools, but we understand that they're not completely beneficent, that they're not neutral, and that we have to be very, very careful. Paul, you know, I would describe you as a man of great gusto with a great appetite for life. Hugs are in ready supply to anyone who's ever met you, and much joy is your signature. But I know that joy is a pretty serious matter to you, and I wondered, you know, if you could comment on what you do to nurture personal joy.
That's one of my favorite questions, you know. I think I find joy itself comes easy for me. But I also find that frustration and impatience come easy for me. And I find that most of my emotion comes easy for me. And so I don't have to cultivate joy very much, because I've just been this lucky guy that has, my dad said that when I was growing up. He said, you always have a twinkle in your eye. And I just feel so grateful and blessed by that. But it's interesting is to understand that that on the other side, that being joyful can also mean that there are a lot of other emotions in your life and personality traits that are also easy, and that emotions generally come easy. And I think it's hard for one to be in groups sometimes, and particularly in leadership at times. And I have to spend a lot of time explaining myself, including around joy. So I wish I could answer the question, Al, that here are the 5 key elements to joy. I think that you know, there are kind of practices, and you know, for me, meditation is one of them. I always start every meditation by the power and truth of this practice. May all beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all be free of sorrow and the causes of sorrow. And so I think in some ways that's a hope. I hope that I don't actually use joy to cover up pain. But I find that as a world, there is so much awe in what's all around us, and in people, and in places. And so I find that I don't want to be Pollyanna, particularly in a world where what we've just seen in Paris happens over and over again. And there are times when it becomes very dark. Yeah, I don't feel like I answered your question.
You did, and we've reached the end. Paul, thank you immensely. Thank you,
well,
listeners.
Thank you, Al. First of all, for this interview, but also just again for this amazing book and for doing this Bookinar, in which you're going to be taking us through a series of interviews of people that are so amazing and who have much more amazing stories than I do. And we're going to be hearing them and engaging in them and learning from them. And it allows us to read your book in a whole new way. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, you're welcome. It's been great fun. Next session is with Marion Thompson, the co-founder of La Leche League, an amazing woman. I'm going to say goodbye for now and pass us back to Christy. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Al and Paul, for sharing your insights and perspectives with us on the call today. That was just really wonderful. And I just want to say we received so many great questions from people who are on the call today, and I promise that I will find a way to get these questions to Al and Paul and share them with people. So I also want to thank all of you for being on the call today. Your comments and questions have helped to make this a dynamic and thought-provoking conversation. A big thank you to our partners who have helped make this series possible: BC Partners for Social Impact Plan, Planned Lifetime Advocacy Network, Social Innovation Generation, ABCD in Action, and Ashoka. Last but certainly not least, we would like to thank our supporters, Human Resources and Social Development Canada, the Maitrey Foundation, J.W. McConnell Family Foundation, and the Province of Ontario. As promised, in a few days, we will email you with links to the audio and other material related to today's call, including a code for your free download copy of Al's book. We also welcome your feedback on these calls, so please do email Tamarack to let us know how we are doing. We encourage you to go online and register for the next 2 Bookinar sessions. As Al mentioned, the next one is on Tuesday, December 1st, 2015, from noon till 1 p.m. I will be joined by Marion Thompson, co-founder of La Leche League, for the Pattern Think and Act Like Movement. On Tuesday, December 15th, again at noon, I will be joined by Sean Moore, founder of the Advocacy School, to talk about the pattern Advocate with Empathy. For those of you who are in Toronto, please join Al tonight at 7 p.m. for the St. Andrew's Heart of the City Speaker Series, Fix the 6, 8-Minute Solutions, Toronto Style. And finally, we have some really exciting events coming up with Tamarack, and we encourage you to visit our website, www.tamarackcommunity.ca, to learn more and sign up for our monthly e-magazine, Engage. Thanks again, everyone. We really appreciate you joining us today. Thanks, Al and Paul. Have a great day, everyone.